Today I can confirm that after weeks of frustration from players and CEOs alike, Larian will not be using generative AI for their writing or their concept art. Now those were the two things that made fans feel betrayed. Of course, some argue that they didn't really need to change course. The way some thought about it is that however they choose to make their games, ultimately the final quality would speak for itself. But it's very clear that Larian wanted to regain the faith of their audience. So they did what they're essentially best known for. They engaged directly with players, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so Larian came into 2026 wanting to talk about their big new game, Divinity. You see, there are now 500 people across 7 studios working in that game. It's in full production, and when we take a look at the Response AMA that's kicked off this whole video, we do see it covers features, narrative direction, and lessons learned from Baldur's Gate 3. But that wasn't the big talk of the town. No, the AI stuff was. So the very first question answered by Larian was not one about their games, it was one about their development process. And what we learned is that they're taking the complaints seriously. The Bloomberg interview stuff, so generative AI in concept art and in writing, basically had hurt them. Sven Vinke, I think, swearing in a little bit of frustration, perhaps thinking this kind of is blown out of proportion. That was just the surface of things, and it was quite loud. But underneath, it's clear that Larian had wanted to soothe fans who felt just betrayed by what they've seen as hypocrisy. And that's why the first thing said in the AMA was that they were, in fact, backing down. In the AMA, Vinke wasted no time. He reiterated that they never generated, quote, actual concept art with generative AI, in his view. But now, in response to the confusion around the topic, he went and he said this. To ensure there's no room for doubt, we've decided to refrain from using Gen AI tools during concept art development. That way, there can be no discussion about the origin of the art. And actually, I'd say it's that second part that matters here, because Vinke is acknowledging the fear that Larian was using tools that were basically trained on assets grabbed from the internet, which obviously a lot of people, a lot of artists have a big problem with, understandably so. Basically, the idea is that using these tools would risk poisoning any concept art or finished work generated afterwards. Now they've just decided, no, we won't use that at all, so it's not even something that we're going to be questioning. Now, going on in a little bit more detail, their art director actually echoed the framing from the interview that kicked off this whole drama a while ago. He basically said the tech was used for mood boards, doodles, combinations of text and images, not final art. But now it's basically not being used at all. I suppose the Steelman case is that if you are not an artist and you're struggling to convey a visual idea, at least these tools may allow you to basically say, look, I'm struggling to get the exact words for what I mean, but this mood board thingy that I generated, that basically communicates it. Now, obviously, whether that passes your sniff test or not is completely up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I'd say that was more originally the framing that they were going for. It didn't fully land. A lot of nuance was lost. I think this is the better decision to just say, no, we'll remove this fear entirely by not engaging. But of course, it's not just pixels. It's also words. The writing director, Adam Smith, followed up on the writing side of things, talking about the generated placeholder text that was mentioned in the interview with Jason Schreier that set all of this stuff off a while ago. What did Sven mean whenever he was talking about that? Well, in Adam Smith's words, it didn't. Basically, Larian ran a test with a small number of writers who were using generative tools to create placeholder text for research, not for the game. The results, according to him, were worse than even his, quote, worst first drafts, hitting a, quote, 3 out of 10 at best. The game design team also confirmed that it couldn't be used there either, that the technology simply, for them, wasn't productive. And you know what? As I record this, I think I'm stumbling onto a little bit of an insight here. One of the reasons we're seeing so much slop in the world is that all of this technology makes the cost of creation way lower. I use the word creation there. Obviously, a lot of people would say, no, that's the cost of generation, hence the slop. I get that. The real point that I'm driving towards, though, is that the distinguishing factor is actually taste. Because in the hands of people who wouldn't look at those drafts and think, God, that's a 3 out of 10, that's a bit shit. If someone doesn't have the taste to know that, they'll think that the generation is perfectly fine. That's how you'll end up getting loads and loads and loads of slop. I think when you take a look at what's going on the internet right now, maybe there is, when we look in there, a lot to talk about a lack of media literacy, maybe a lack of literacy, people understanding history, culture, all of that stuff in a rich fashion, in a way that develops, in this case, a professional taste. And I guess when you look at a studio like Larian and you think about the strengths of their writers, it is because, yes, in addition to crafting magnificent words, they also do that with good taste. They know what good is, they know what good isn't, and that's what allows them to make a fantastic final product. And I think that's where the hype and the grifting about the generative AI really hurts the AI field, because ultimately, it seems a lot of people are just trying to use it to fast track to an end product, maybe because they're valuing having a product more than they are the quality and the art of that product. And maybe that is why so many things are ringing so hollow and feeling so much like slop. I never really expected Larian would go full in that direction, because the thing they've proven they have is taste. And maybe that is why exploration of these tools worried people as much as it did. But to get back to the practical, what this means is that Divinity going forward will have no generative AI stuff in concept art, writing, or game design. At the very least, that's what leadership says. Whether you trust, well, that is completely up to you. But the game is now in full production, so there is a little bit of a grey area where existing concept art maybe had some influence from that original process and those original tests, but at least going forward now, the standard is clear and it's been made clear in public. But there's a little bit of an asterisk, and that's because Larian still has a director of machine learning. So we should talk about that. Alright, so one of the people answering questions here was Gabriel Bosk. Basically, he's Larian's machine learning director. Now, machine learning director is not generative AI director, and I know we could have a talk about semantics and the computer science side of things, but let's just kind of go with the more commonly understood definitions there. Basically, he described uses of machine learning that wouldn't apply to things like Midjourney or ChatGPT. And these are things like reducing a bunch of the human-done grunt work that would be needed for, say, processing thousands of voice lines. Things like cleaning up animation stuff. Because basically, whenever you get raw mocap data, it's very much not that mocap is a magic box that gets you an amazing performance in your game. But before an animator is even applying their creative skills to that, they have so much data cleanup to do. So automating something like that using machine learning seems like a great way to allow the animator to, focus on their big skill set. Animating. But there is another generative thing that Gabriel talked about. It's one built entirely on Larian's internal data, where what they're doing is they're using their own motion capture footage and audio to generate new movement for lines that don't have any mocap. That gives the animation team a base from which they can adjust and edit. Now, I know you've probably heard of things like that before. One of the great examples would be the default facial animations that you get in, say, Mass Effect Andromeda. The thing is, that was a less sophisticated approach, which meant that the default was really not that good. You could say that when you're Larian and you've got all of the data that they have, that they could make that automated system far better in terms of raising up the floor and then letting their animators actually do work where it really has impact. So that's what he talked about, and while Larian is no problem tinkering with mocap to fill in gaps, one thing they've confirmed is they won't use this stuff for voice work, and Gabriel explained that basically they've got contractual agreements not to clone actors' voices. That means that even if an actor was fine with the technology or the compensation model, Larian, quote, don't currently feel comfortable, and they're, quote, aware of how sensitive it can be to artificially generate an actor's voice. Larian kind of weighs everything here in the machine learning and maybe AI category on a case-by-case basis. And overall, I think we see them do a great job with this AMA, but there is still a little bit of attention left for some, and it's something that Sven Vincke expressed in his first post, and that is that Larian is not writing off the technology completely. So they are going to keep experimenting, presumably more tests like, say, ones that the writers ran. And his argument is basically a, quote, more focused development cycle, less waste, and ultimately a higher quality game. Now, he says he wants to leave the door open in cases where the technology actually is helpful to the process, but he also gave a guarantee for anything that is player-facing. Here's the guarantee. If there's any generated, quote, creative assets that end up in a Larian game, Larian will be 100% sure they know the origins of the training data and have consent from those who created it. Specifically, what he said is this: if we use a Gen AI model to create in-game assets, then it'll be trained on data that we own. Now, what he describes there is functionally kind of like the mocap tool that we've already talked about, that they've already built, but I think also there's some hedging for the future there. And here's the thing, right? Every example in this AMA is of generated assets that weren't good enough to ship, right? The writing, the concept art elements, none of those things could go in a game, in a sort of click the button and now the thing is done. Even the more successful thing in the mocap data is basically just a tool to help their animators. And problems like that with mocap data are the sort of thing that a machine learning approach can, I think, inherently do quite well at. As with those other things, say the writing or image generation, well, the theoretical models that Sven Vincke is talking about don't really seem to exist yet. So what I basically mean there is that while you could get an open source image model and then do a bunch of fine-tuning specifically on stuff that Larian fully owns, well, the thing is, what was that open source model trained off? Was it just trained off data, images, artwork that's just been scraped from the whole internet? That's essentially the trouble here. What you would need is a foundational image model that is designed for, say, whatever type of game art that you're doing, that has been fundamentally trained using stuff that you have got copyright for. And then that is something that you could fine-tune for a specific development studio's use case. As far as I'm aware, that's not really something that exists currently. I mean, you'll see loads of people say, wow, look at all of these bits of 8-bit art that I've generated with ChatGPT or Gemini. Well, yeah, of course, those models have slurped up all of the pixel art that they can find in the internet, which of course is stuff that they probably did not have commercial rights to. Hence the problem. But here's the thing, I'm only talking about right now, because building something like that, the model that would hit all of their bars for, say, images, that, if your standard is 100% ethical sourcing of all of your training data, is extremely hard. Probably not really in the cards right now. So why bring it up? I think it's quite obvious. It's because in the future, it almost certainly will exist. And then we're really going to have a serious talk. You see, one of the things Larian pushed back on the hardest through the AMA was the claim that they are pushing hard on generative AI. Pushing hard is a quote from Jason Schreier's characterization of what Sven said to him in the interview. Now, in this case, the main people involved both stated in the AMA that every team member has full autonomy on the tools that they use, that there is no mandate. As an example, a mandate to use AI. Indeed, their art director Jarl maintained that Vincke had been misquoted on that point, but Vincke himself especially seems to want to leave the door open for ethical, productive uses of the technology in some undefined future. That's a future that may not exist yet, but he wants the company to be ready should that future exist. For many people, that may still feel like pushing hard, but I'd argue it is extremely different from the idea that they are searching for ways to throw Midjourney and ChatGPT dialogue into their game to save time and money. I don't think the evidence backs up that perception thus far. But what does this actually mean for players? Number one, Larian are obviously aware of how the perception of the studio has been damaged over the last few weeks. They wouldn't be doing this AMA, and they wouldn't be effectively banning bits of technology for some of their teams if they didn't care about what people thought. Even if they themselves aren't worried about that, they know that other people are. And that's what this is all optimized around. I mean, they could have done what Activision does, just obfuscate how much they're using and press on and not properly engage with it. The contrast, and I think the main takeaway, is that here they've chosen to engage. They've done that even under a lot of pressure and a fairly hot media situation. And I think that is a sign that they're willing to act in good faith. And of course, more importantly, they have set a standard out in public. Whenever you do that, it's basically saying, these are our words, you need to hold us to those words. If we go against those words, we will have broken your trust. It's a good way to establish trust. And it means that if generative AI shows up in Divinity, in the art or the writing, people will remember this AMA, when Larian said they would not do that, when they said it would only be ethically sourced, internally trained models, because that now is the benchmark. That is the bar that any of this tech would have to hit. Whether or not Larian are able to hit their own benchmark, well, that remains to be seen. We can't look into the future. But they have given people something concrete to point towards. Do you know what? That is a hell of a lot more than most studios have offered thus far. So, for that, absolutely credit to them. And you know what? Credit to many of you for the existence of this next story. Turns out console sales have absolutely cratered, and ultimately it's because people looked at the offerings and have clearly said no. And that is having large reverberations across the industry, with even one major publisher describing the PS5 barrier. You can learn all about that in this video next.